What's up, everybody? Mike Walsh here. So today I want to talk about Ilia Topuria and how much his legacy has now been damaged with the loss to Justin Gaethje, because there's a few things that go into that. For one, he's no longer undefeated. Two, he, of course, has lost his title. He is no longer a sitting champion because he vacated the featherweight belt when he moved up to lightweight. Now he's lost the lightweight belt. And moreover, he's not only lost, but he lost to sort of the worst guy of his recent crop of opponents, or at least a guy who was perceived to be ahead of time. Most people, myself included, thought that of the four, Volkanovski, Holloway, Oliveira, and Gaethje, that Gaethje was sort of the easiest matchup. He was the most of a layup. I'm sure the odds reflected that. I'm sure he was the biggest underdog of the four. So to lose to him is a big deal. If you didn't see it, I put out a video last week sort of cautioning about this. And if not about this, then about what could have come after. So I made a video called something to the effect of, will Ilia become the next Khamzat? And some people appreciated that video, but I got a lot of pushback. However, I've also got people returning to that video after the fact and saying, oh, this aged really well. But basically, I saw a lot of similarities in the career trajectories of Ilia and Khamzat. I thought prior to their most recent fights that their resumes had a lot in common. The quality of their resumes had a lot in common. And now after the fight, I feel even more so. But basically my point was that Khamzat himself was an undefeated guy. He had success in two weight classes. He became one of the top contenders at welterweight and had trouble with the weight cut, so he went up to middleweight. Had success up there, became a champion, beat some good names, beat a similar amount of good names, and overall just a similar combination of okay to good to great names as Ilia. If you just look at their resumes, with Ilia having beaten guys like, Zalal and Mitchell and Ryan Hall and Josh Emmett, all in the come up, and then having beaten Volkanovski, Holloway, and Oliveira. That's not that dissimilar to beating, the Leech, Kevin Holland, GM3, kind of those guys on the come up, beating Gilbert Burns, and then beating a guy who was the recent welterweight champion in Kamaru, a middleweight great in Robert Whittaker, and then beating Dricus du Plessis, the sitting champion, and a guy a lot of people were very high on at the time. Don't get me wrong, Ilia's resume is better, and he is doing it in better weight classes, but name for name and sort of trajectory for trajectory, weight class for weight class, that's not that different. Yeah, these guys' careers had a lot in common. And what happened to Khamzat? He takes on this guy who's a big underdog, massive underdog. Anytime a big upset happens, people question if it's the biggest upset in the history of the UFC or the biggest upset in the history of the sport. Neither Gaethje beating Ilia nor Sean beating Khamzat were that big of upsets, but they were both big upsets. And yeah, Sean was a huge underdog going in. I'm not sure I saw anyone picking him. I'm sure someone did, but there was someone who picked Nunes to lose as well. But from what I saw, basically no one picked him. And he was only kind of deserving of the shot. Imanov was there. Sean was coming off one win. I was okay with it. I made videos defending it, saying if you take out someone like Hernandez and finish him, and Hernandez maybe didn't bring the most grappling to bear in that fight, but he's the sort of opponent, this pace-pushing grappler, that breaks people. He's the sort of opponent you should have to get past if you want to make an argument that you can beat Khamzat. And so I was fine with all that. I'm not a huge Imanov fan, and Imanov's resume, or not resume as a whole, but his argument for a title shot wasn't actually that much stronger than Sean's. But it was stronger, and Sean got the shot instead, and it was largely to do with Sean being a bigger star, and Sean and Khamzat having beef, and that kind of stuff. That's why he got that shot. I was okay with it. But again, he wasn't really the number one contender, and he was this massive underdog. And it felt like if you were going to compare beating Sean to beating Dricus and beating Usman and guys like that, it felt like not the best win of the bunch, potentially. And, for Khamzat, should he have gotten it? And I thought it was a very similar thing for Ilia. Again, where, Gaethje's a good win, but he's not the top contender. Actually, he might have been the interim champion, but we all know Arman was the actual top contender at lightweight. And again, he would have, in my view, been kind of the worst of his last 4 wins. So, I thought that was a similar place to be in, and I thought that Ilia could either lose and be in damn near the exact place that Khamzat is in and have this huge fall from grace and no longer be undefeated, or he could win, but then potentially lose his next fight against someone like an Arman, or against someone like an Islam, or against someone like a BSD, whoever, and that could still create a similar narrative, Unfortunately for Ilia, even that hypothetical didn't play out. What actually played out is that he had nearly the exact same fall from grace that now that Khamzat has had. And even worse so, because at least Khamzat, despite looking bad, despite them both fatiguing, despite that being a similar theme in both fights, only strengthening the comparison, only strengthening the parallel between them. Despite that, at least Khamzat, took it the distance. At least Khamzat arguably won. I scored it for Sean. I think that's the stronger argument is for Sean winning. But it's a very close fight. You're not like insane, I think, if you think Khamzat won. I think there's a lot of cope, a lot of people who are just bitter, but like that was a very close fight. Whereas, of course, Ilia just started losing from round 3 onward and then quit on his stool. Much worse look. So, if anything, this has become more true than that video even flirted with. So, what to make of all that? Where does Ilia stand now? Hyping up my old video aside, like how much actual damage has this done to his legacy? What does this mean going forward? So, a couple of things there. If you've watched any of my GOAT list videos, which I've put out 3 since last summer, in none of them did I place Ilia Topuria. And 2 of those lists went as high as top 20, and I did not include Ilia on any of the lists. Now, my reasoning for that wasn't that he necessarily hadn't done enough yet to warrant being like a top 20 GOAT. My issue was that he was too young in his career. My issue was that we've seen guys rise very quickly, have a lot of success, and fall off. And if you were to just take a snapshot of the peak of their success, you might think, oh my God, this guy's going to go on to be the best fighter ever. Just look at how quickly he's doing all this. But, what goes up must come down. And for some people, it goes up really fucking quickly and it comes down just as quickly. So, for example, Brock Lesnar. There was a time where he was fast tracking his way to being the greatest heavyweight ever. In his 4th fight, he won a UFC title, and he went on to defend it twice, and he fought pretty good names. Heath Herring was a decent veteran of the game. Randy Couture, is a GOAT. Frank Mir is a great heavyweight, former champion. Shane Carwin was this monstrous contender on the come-up. Very scary, seemed like a tough matchup for Brock. And Brock beat all those guys, and he finished all of them but Herring. And again, he did all that within 6 fights. That's insane. That far it surpasses Alex Pereira as far as just speed running his way to the title. Excuse me. And excuse me. But then he goes on to get smashed by Kane and then get smashed by Overeem, and then he sits out for a while, comes back all roided up, and pops when he fights Mark Hunt, and that's it. That's the end of his career. And now he's not even talked about amongst heavyweight greats, But there was a point where he was looking very promising. If you would have made a GOAT list, if you would have made a top 20 GOAT list when he was, after he'd beaten Carwin or something, you wouldn't have been insane to be like, should we include Brock here? Look at what he's done. Look how quickly he's done it. One more win and he'll break the record for title defenses at heavyweight. That would be the thought. Another one would be Conor McGregor, whom I'm going to compare Ilia to more down the road. But when Conor beat Aldo and then later beat Alvarez, he was on top of the world. And if he just stopped there, or if you made a list like that at that point, you'd be pretty fucking tempted to put him on it. And you might be tempted to put him on it very highly, or very high on the list, rather. And I don't think anyone, Conor has to jockey to get top 30 on people's lists these days. You know what I mean? Because we've just seen him lose since. We've seen him lose to Poirier twice. We've seen him lose to Khabib. We kind of just all know that he had, some success at featherweight that was pretty good and was a tough matchup for Aldo. And we know that he got to fight one of the shittier champions in recent years in Eddie Alvarez, and we just know that he wasn't the best lightweight in the world, and we just don't give him that much credit anymore. And bias plays a role there. It's like John Jones is a scumbag and hated rightfully on that front, but John Jones's resume is excessively attacked, and I've made videos in the last several weeks defending Jones's resume. Similar thing happens to Conor, where people don't like him, so they don't give him as much credit as they should. But nevertheless, even if we're being completely fair to Conor, his resume is worse now than it was when he beat Eddie Alvarez, right? Just like Ilia's resume is worse now than it was a week ago, right? And there's other examples like that of fighters that rose very quickly. And if you would have taken a snapshot of them at their very peak, you would have been tempted to throw them on a GOAT list or say oh my God, this might be the best fighter I've ever seen. Oh my God. And then they pretty fucking quickly took a nosedive from there. And now we would all be embarrassed to even suggest that they're amongst the very greatest. Is that going to happen to Ilia? Because his career is not over. When I was abstaining from putting him on the list, it was because we just didn't know. It was too early. There was still time for it to go either way. There was time for him to become the greatest fighter ever, full stop. And there was time for him to just go on a big losing streak and him to be like Sokoju. But the most obscure example of this I have, but he was a light heavyweight. He had a judo background. He was like a Cuban Olympian or something. And he fought in Pride, and within 4 fights, he knocked out Nogueira's brother, who was one of the top light heavyweights, and he knocked out Ricardo Arona, who was also one of the top light heavyweights, and he did both of them within a minute. So everyone was like, oh my God, this guy's the coming man. He's just blowing through. He's going to become a champion, yada, yada. Goes to the UFC, loses to Machida, and from there, his career is just middling. He's had a million fights since, and he's got a 50-50 record, and no one's heard of him. So, again, if you were just do a snapshot of him after beating Arona or beating Nogueira, you might be tempted. He hadn't won a belt yet, so you wouldn't be putting him top 10 GOAT or something, but you'd be maybe you'd put him high on the pound for pound list. Maybe you do something I don't know. You'd be tempted to give him a shitload of credit for just coming onto the scene and doing what he did so quickly and just looking so unstoppable. But didn't pan out. That's maybe the quickest fall off of the list. Now with Ilia, he could rebound. Great fighters have lost in their primes. Jose Aldo is one of the greatest fighters to ever live. People give him less credit these days because one of the new criterion that people are really fixated on is, did you lose in your prime? And I think that's a very reasonable criterion. And if you take that one seriously, Jose Aldo lost to McGregor, he lost to Max twice. He was probably still in his prime when he lost to Volk. Probably not in his prime when he lost to Peter Yan, but that's 3 to 4 clear losses in your prime against fellow greats. So that's a bad look. That keeps Jose from being contending for the number 1 spot or something. But Jose Aldo, nevertheless, is an all-time great fighter. He's somewhere on that list. Shitloads of longevity, great wins across 2 weight classes, great win streaks, a million title defenses, the youngest champion in history in a major promotion. If you count WEC champions, which for that division you should, he was a younger champion than was John Jones when he won the UFC title. And just a laundry list of great names he beat. And he had to come back. Again, he came back from a very embarrassing loss to McGregor. One of the most embarrassing losses probably in the history of the sport, frankly. And compare how Jose Aldo rebounded from the McGregor loss, which you knew he felt because he was very emotionally invested in that fight. The trash talk was really getting to him. The fucking guy is visibly weeping in the cage after the fact. Look at how he rebounded from that, and then look at how Ronda Rousey did not rebound, for example, from her losses against Holly Holm and Nunes. Just compare. So Ilia could do the same. I saw he put out a tweet that was appropriately humble, and just giving Justin credit, not making excuses. That's cool. That's a good look. That's better than nothing. I am an Ilia fan. I still like the guy. So I would like to see him do well. I'm not rooting for his downfall. I don't want him to just go on a 4-fight losing streak now and retire or something. But he's in a tough spot. it's not an impossible spot. Again, other greats have done this. Other greats have lost in their primes and had to come back and go on win streaks and win titles or change weight classes or whatever, and they've pulled it off. Look at Daniel Cormier, undefeated guy. Everyone is pinging him to either be the next heavyweight champion or be the guy to beat John Jones. And what happens? He fights Jones, gets embarrassed. And that's the first fight. That's not the one where Jones popped and it became a no contest. I'm just talking about the first fight where he got decisioned comfortably and out-wrestled and, mocked and emoted on and all that kind of shit. Like, that happened, but Cormier went on to be one of the greats. He went on to win the light heavyweight title, went on to beat Stipe, win the heavyweight title, defend the heavyweight title. Like, this has happened before. Now, unfortunately for Ilia, there's a good chance that number one spot will forever evade him now, because the people in the actual argument for the number one spot, they never lost in their prime in their own weight class. Now, bear that second one in mind for a second, or for a little bit, because I will return to it. So, for example, Fedor never lost in his prime. GSP, GSP lost in his prime. I might have to walk back what I just said. GSP lost in his prime, but he avenged it. So, there's that option. But John Jones never lost in his prime. Mighty Mouse never lost in his prime in his own weight class. Islam never lost in his prime. He lost, earlier when he was on the come-up, but he didn't lose in his prime. Kamaru Usman never lost in his prime. Volkanovski never lost in his prime in his own weight class. It's rare for the guys actually somewhere in the top stratosphere to have lost in their own weight classes. But there's two caveats there. One, the George St. Pierre example, because Pierre has the early loss against Hughes, which he avenges, but the loss against Matt Serra is in his prime. It's when he's a champion. It was that's a much bigger underdog upset win than Justin over Ilia or Sean over Khamzat. Bit of history. But he immediately avenges it and then goes on a massive win streak. So, that's a guy who did actually lose in his prime, but since he's so clearly erased the loss, in most people's eyes, it's not a big deal. Ilia could do that. If Ilia gets the rematch and nukes Justin, maybe that could happen. I think that, though, will be a tougher sell because Justin's old, and granted, Matt Serra was older too. I don't think he was 37. I'd have to double check, but he was a veteran. He might have been past his prime, but Justin's quite old. So if you just outlast him and knock him out in a rematch, are we going to give you as much credit? And B, George got caught and then just ran, he got caught in the first fight. And it was set up, Matt Serra threw the body, finally came up top, and he clipped George with it. Fair enough. But that didn't show that he, broke George. That didn't show that, style for style, he actually had much of, a solution to George. He had a good trick to set him up and get the finish in a one-off, but stylistically, he didn't really show, again, that he was a very poisonous matchup or anything. Whereas Justin, I feel did a more comprehensive job showing that he is a tough fight for Ilia. And if Ilia comes back and just gets an early knockout or something, I'm not sure we're going to just erase that loss effectively. Not that we genuinely erased it for George. We don't treat him as undefeated, but we still largely view George St. Pierre as an untarnished fighter because of how emphatically he avenged his losses and proved he was the better man. Does that make sense? So I'm not sure that's as on the table for Ilia. He'd have to come back and put on a masterclass. He'd have to say, look, he'd have to make some excuses. Maybe he'd have to say, look, I'd had some time off. I was going through that personal shit. I underestimated the guy. I genuinely thought I could just march him down and take him out. He surprised me a little bit. He brought some skills the jab and some of the takedowns that I expect him to bring. But now I know that's going to happen, and I am the better man, and I will show up, and I will just put on a masterclass, and I will emphatically in all phases prove he has nothing for me. If he did that, then maybe. then maybe. If he did that and then went on a big fucking win streak, he could get the George St. Pierre treatment, perhaps. But there's a lot of ifs in that statement, or in that hypothesis, because A, I'm not sure Justin Gaethje is going to give him the rematch. B, and meaning like he might not give him the immediate rematch, and if Gaethje might retire, Gaethje might have one more fight, like Gaethje might win one more fight and then retire, or lose his next fight and then retire, and just it might play out such that Ilia never fights the man again, in which case, boom, this loss is very much not erased. And they might have a rematch and Gaethje might just win. That could happen. And they could have the rematch. Ilia could win, but not win in the way he kind of needs to win for that narrative I laid out to happen. Or he could even win in the way that he needs to, but then just not go on a big win streak. If he pretty comfortably beats Justin, but then like loses his next fight to Armin or someone, then like, he's in the same spot again. He's not going to escape the narrative of like being a guy who lost in his prime. Which again, if you want to be one of the greatest to ever live, you kind of need that to not happen. However, I mentioned that the other detail is that you need to not lose in your prime in your own weight class. I know that Ilia won the lightweight title. I know that he beat Charles Oliveira, a man I still have ahead of Justin Gaethje as like an all-time GOAT and as a lightweight GOAT. I get all that. I get that he beat Holloway down at featherweight, but who's had success at lightweight, who's beaten Justin himself. I get all that. But just look at the size of Ilia. This is not actually his weight class. His weight class is featherweight. It's similar to McGregor, where McGregor clearly had better success at featherweight than he did at lightweight. Some of that was maybe the power not carrying over as much. Some of that was just like the reach and frame being more challenging. The bigger up he went, Conor dwarfing people at featherweight versus having a reach disadvantage over someone like Nate Diaz, did affect him. Hold on a sec. And it's even more exaggerated with Ilia, because Ilia is like a smaller guy in terms of skeletal frame than is Conor McGregor. I know that he said the weight cut was hard and yada yada, and he's caked up, so he's maybe heavier than he looks, but like, or than his height and reach would suggest, but he is a featherweight. He's a featherweight who's having success at lightweight. If Ilia goes back down to featherweight and just becomes a Volkanovski down there, meaning has a reign like Volkanovski had, we might kind of retcon this loss to Justin as just being like, look, he went up to lightweight. The guy's clearly a featherweight. He's now like one of the featherweight GOATs. He won the title. He beat Oliveira. Maybe it was too much to ask that he just become a defending champion up there and maybe go up to welterweight and that kind of shit. That's not his weight class. He is a featherweight, because at that level, like, if you're me, like, you don't hold it against Demetrius Johnson that he lost to Dominic Cruz at bantamweight. Where he was just massively undersized. And Mighty Mouse had success at bantamweight, like he beat Miguel Torres, who was a big win at the time. But, he was undersized at flyweight. Like, Mighty Mouse is a very small dude. He's not had a size advantage over, like, literally anyone he's ever fought. And at bantamweight, he was just tiny. So, to me, it's just not reasonable to hold that against him. If you're a great fighter and some of your prime is spent fighting outside your weight class and you lose against great fighters, that could happen to anyone. Most great fighters aren't tested in that way. Did Khabib on the come up, did Khabib during his like RDA, Pat Healy kind of part of his career, did he have to go up to welterweight and fight Rory McDonald or something? Was he tested in that way? No, he was not. He might have won. He might have, like, it's a hypothetical. I'm not saying it's a given he would lose in those fights, but he never had to be proven in that way. And he retired before ever changing weight classes. So, like, I have a hard time holding that against someone like Mighty Mouse. And again, if Ilia, is seriously a featherweight, which I think he is, maybe this loss shouldn't actually count for that much, actually. However, if none of these things kind of play out, if he doesn't like kind of rebound, if he doesn't like start beating guys again up at lightweight, if he doesn't avenge the loss against Gaethje, if he doesn't go back down to featherweight and just start cleaning house like Volk did, if these kind of things don't happen, if he just sort of maybe gets one more win, maybe he fights Paddy Pimblett and wins and then gets smashed by Arman and then retires or something. If his career looks more like Conor McGregor, the other obvious parallel to him, if it looks more like that, then he's still not going to be considered that highly amongst the greats because, like McGregor's weight class was probably featherweight, and his losses are all at lightweight. But even there, like, he just didn't have enough wins to be considered one of the greatest. You know? Yes, he's got some good wins. He beats like a young Poirier. He beats a short notice Mendez. He beats Aldo. Those are great wins. But they're not enough. They're not enough on their own to be like, yeah, you're like a top 5 GOAT. And similarly, even if Ilia only loses at lightweight, if his career sort of fizzles out with a couple of losses here in similar fashion, yeah, beating a kind of old Volk, an old Oliveira, and even a kind of old Max, like beating all those guys, they're great wins. You know, Josh Emmett's a good win. Bryce Mitchell's a good win. But altogether, it's not going to be enough to make him one of the GOATs, even if the losses maybe shouldn't count for as much because they're up a weight class. See what I'm saying? I think already Ilya's probably done the best of the three, meaning if I'm comparing him to Conor and Khamzat, I think his resume is probably already the best. His wins are the best. I think Oliveira and Holloway and Volk, even with the ages, being caveated, I think even with that, those are probably a better collection of wins than like McGregor's wins over Aldo and Alvarez and like Diaz, or Mendez. And they're probably better than Khamzat's wins over like old man Kamaru and kind of old man Rob and against Strickus. You know what I mean? So I think Ilya's already ahead. I think if you currently have Ilia as a vaguely top 30 fighter, I don't think you're insane. But, because that's not, Conor McGregor sniffing that territory as well. But, yeah, I think he's in a tough spot. I think he needs to, a tough spot, not in terms of like never getting a win again, not in terms of never being a great fighter again or being seen as a great fighter again, but in terms of like chasing real GOAT status, either the actual tippy top number 1 spot or even just like top 10, just sort of just being considered one of the greats alongside people like, alongside people like Anderson Silva and Khabib and Kamaru Usman and, Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar, like guys like that. Like if he wants to be considered alongside those guys, it's going to be an uphill battle, because, again, ways he can do it are like thoroughly avenge the loss to Gaethje or, just go on great win streaks either at lightweight or at bantamweight. And again, if he does the latter, then someone like me might just kind of retcon the Gaethje one a little bit and be like, yeah, that wasn't his weight class. So what do you want the guy to do? But that's a lot to ask, like this, he's going to his confidence is going to be compromised to some degree, and maybe not, maybe he's much more mentally resilient than that speculation claims, but I don't know. He looks like a fighter that relied on his confidence, and he looked like a fighter in his fights who needed confidence. Like he looked like a fighter who could wilt if he wasn't able to bully the guy, The guy quit on the stool, for Christ's sake, and that's where like Paddy Pimblett is having this like moral victory lap because he's like, yeah, I took all of that damage from Justin. He did even more damage to me, arguably, and I went the distance with him, and I actually made it like competitive at points. And Ilia made it more than competitive early on, but he means later in the fight, and yeah, like. Paddy gets to say that. Paddy's not wrong to say that. Like he's kind of earned the ability to say that with how his fight went and with how Ilia's fight went. So, it's a rough spot for Ilia. And I do like Ilia. I'm not rooting for his downfall. It'd be cool if he went on to still be a great in his own right. It would be kind of lame and a loss for the sport if he just fizzled out. Similarly, it'd be lame and a loss for the sport if Khamzat fizzles out after this. He's got his own demons to face right now with what he's going to do with his career. But both guys are young. Both guys are very talented. Ilia, I'll make a video this week doing my sort of version of like what fights to make next. Like, and in that I will give my thoughts on like who should retire, who shouldn't retire. Should Alex stay at heavyweight? Should Ilia stay at lightweight? I'll answer those questions in that video. But sort of tipping my hat in that direction, I don't think it would be a bad idea for Ilia to go back down to featherweight. So that's all I've got on that. I think this video's gotten fairly long. But let me know what you think. Let me know where Ilia stands. Let me know what you think in terms of like whether he should stay at lightweight or go back down to featherweight. Let me know what you think he needs to do to be considered one of the greats. Let me know if you think it's still even possible for him to become in conversation with that like upper echelon, with the Mighty Mouses, the GSPs, the Islams, like those kinds of guys. Is it even possible for Ilia to get back in the mix or have the potential to be thrown into the mix with them like he did have that potential prior to losing to Justin? Let me know what you think. And in any case, like, comment, subscribe. Check out my second YouTube channel. It's called Michael Walsh Nerd Stuff. I'll link it below. I cover nerd stuff, anime, comic books, video games, sci-fi, etc. I should have a video coming today sort of giving my thoughts on the upcoming Insomniac Wolverine video game. So check that out if you're interested. If not, no worries. I got you covered here with MMA stuff. And in any case, take care.